Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Edwards for the University of Wyoming Extension. I thought our guest was going to get up and walk away during our and just leave us.
And we're done.
Hi, I missed it.
My co-host today is Jeremiah Vardaman. Again, good morning, Jeremiah. How are you?
Good morning. Doing good. How about you, Jeff?
Great. Good to see you. And
You
our
too.
guest today is Bill Stump. Good morning, Bill.
Morning.
Glad you came back.
Didn't leave us and abandon us.
Bill Stump is the plant pathologist for UW Wyoming and is stationed in Laramie. And we're going to be talking today about diseases affecting our gardens and maybe a few other things if we get a little sidetracked. Who knows, right? A couple of things we'd like to mention. If you are using Zoom, if you're new or not new to Zoom, if you take your mouse and go over the top of it, you'll see two buttons at the bottom, the Q&A button or the chat button. If you would like to interact with us, please use those, ask questions, those types of things through those venues. If you are using Facebook today, please use the chat box. And as always, our fourth person with us is Jenny Thompson. You might not be able to see her, but you can hear her occasionally. She will push some of those Facebook questions to us, and we will get them asked of Bill or ourselves. So I think with that, okay, good. Thumbs up.
We're
good.
ready to roll.
All right. Okay. So Bill, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. We're happy to have you here, and let's talk about plant disease today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's nice to actually talk to some people for a change, even though it is over this kind of format. And also, I'm offering limited edition background screenshots of man cave offices. So
Oh, nice.
This is, it's very realistic.
It won't lock your phone, right?
No. So,
Concepts of what you could do, right?
well, I tried the screenshots in the back, and it doesn't work very well. You get that ghosting image, and I just don't really like it. So. But yeah, so I've been the extension plant pathologist since 2014 now. I actually have been in Wyoming, well, off and on since 81, but I was on campus since 95. And so I've been here for a while. I'm gonna just kind of go over some basics in plant pathology on kind of things you might expect to see in the gardens. And also I want to make sure people are aware that we do have a free diagnostic clinic where people can send samples in, and that could be either via photos or through live submissions and things like that. And Jenny will provide some of that information, the links for that, where you can access some of those forms. So without further ado, I guess I'll open up my presentation.
While you're getting your presentation going, Bill, can you give us a highlight of what a plant pathologist does on a regular basis? I don't think that's a profession most people know about. Are you in surgical gowns and masks and gloves and dissecting plants? What does that look like?
Who are you and what do you do?
That's a good question. So I have like a lot of extension specialists, I have a three-way split, which for a lot of people in academia find this to be the kiss of death in terms of trying to get tenure, because we have a wide range. For us, a lot of us in Wyoming, we're one person deep in a lot of our disciplines. And so plant pathologists, I have statewide responsibilities then for anything related to plant diseases. So my research program is mostly in agronomic diseases. So I work in sugar beets, dry beans, some small grains. I used to dabble in potatoes as well. And so I try to address, existing pathology issues for the state of Wyoming. Like for sugar beet growers, I work a lot with soil-borne diseases and foliar diseases. And then also on the extension side, like I mentioned before, I run the diagnostic clinic so people can send in samples that we can try to diagnose what their problems are and to provide backup to extension agents in the field, things like that, when they're addressed with kind of issues in terms of plant problems. And also I have a teaching responsibility. I teach 2 plant pathology classes, another class in the ecology of plant protection. And so I have a fairly high teaching appointment as well as research responsibility. So on any given day, I wear a number of different hats, and it's kind of nice for people that don't like to focus on any one particular thing. If you get bored with one thing, you can jump to the other. So it's been kind of nice for somebody that tends to be a little ADHD, a little bit maybe.
I was just going to ask you if you had to have that to work in your profession.
It definitely helps. I mean, you got to really jump around. So it's a pretty neat job because every day is different. So you know, some days I'll have a particular plant from a flower or something like that, and another day I'm going to have a forage grass being grown for seed.
If you could have somebody send you the optimum sample, how would you prefer to receive it?
So optimum sample, of course, if possible, I would like to see the entire plant. Of course, don't be sending me a tree. But if it's something from the garden or things like that, you know, include the roots and the plant. And you want to package it. A lot of people seem to think you want to wrap it in wet paper towels and things like that. You don't want to introduce any moisture at all into your sample because it'll be a rotted mess by the time I get it. You would extract the plant from the soil, preserve as much roots as you can, and then just kind of wrap it in dry paper towels and put it in a bag and then ship it. And then unfortunately, mailing is a little wonky this year because of COVID. For some reason, they're only delivering mail once a week.
Right.
On campus. And so, but if people send it UPS or FedEx, which gets kind of pricey, those are delivered the day they do come, which is more beneficial. But sometimes I'll get samples that have been sitting in central receiving for a number of days. Also, to make it even better is actually submit pictures with it as well. And I always tell people to take pictures of the problem close up and then back off a little bit and then back off way in and take a picture of the entire environment around it. And using that last picture is very telling when you take a picture of the entire environment, because it tells a lot about the level of care that the client may be giving that plant or things like that. Like if I see cactus growing in the lawn and things like that, or tumbleweeds going past, you know, it may indicate they're not really watering enough. So those kind of things really help, you know, both pictures and live samples. A lot of times people will send me dead material, which is not good. Usually if there's a disease, you want to send a portion of that. It's the unaffected tissue and then that transition zone for when it goes into the area that's affected by the pathogen.
That transition zone is really diagnostic, right? It helps you identify what's going on.
Exactly. And if we tried to do any kind of isolations, that's where you're going to get it from. If I get just dead tissue, there's no hope of really recovering any pathogens because then it's just full of saprophytes.
So by isolations, you mean cultivating whatever the organism is that's doing the damage in your lab?
Every now and again, I'll culture things if it's possible, or I'll take samples and put them in a humid chamber to try to get it to sporulate if it's a fungus, because that way you can readily identify well, not always, but sometimes you can identify certain fungi, but what kind of spores or fruiting structures they produce.
Or at least identify that it is an organism that's attacking the plant and not an abiotic stress.
Right, but again, it's really difficult to differentiate between pathogens and saprophytes. Like for this picture here, if I were to take this lesion right here, I would want to take a little piece here where that margin is, because that's where anything active is going to be. If I just took a dead piece and put that in a Petri plate, I'd get all kinds of things growing in there, not necessarily the pathogen.
Sure.
Right. So let's get started into your presentation then, Bill.
Okay. So I'm going to start off with just a simple definition. You know, a lot of times people don't really realize what plant disease is, or plants could get sick at all, but plants do. And the simplest one I like is any disturbance of a plant that interferes with its normal structure, function, or economic value. And the last part is kind of interesting. So if you have a flower that may have a virus or something like that will cause discoloration, things like that, it may not affect the plant's normal. It still may be able to function normally. It may be able to grow out and things like that. But if it aesthetic values are reduced, then it can be considered a plant disease as well. So a disease doesn't always mean that that plant's going to die. It just means that something's interfering with it. And economic value too. It's like if you can get discoloration in certain produce, they may be perfectly fine. Like potatoes are a good example. If you get certain kind of diseases that just form on the skin of the potato, you usually can just peel that right off and still eat that potato. But its economic value is compromised because people will pass over that in the groceries or at the farmers markets. And as well, sometimes they may not store as well. And so there's a lot of different things that can kind of play into plant disease. So because of that, plant diseases can be caused by biotic or living agents, or it could be caused by what we call abiotic or non-living factors. And I have these pictures to kind of try and illustrate that. This just shows some of the major pathogen groups and their size comparisons, because most pathogens of plants are microscopic, and so you can't see them. With the naked eye, you typically have to use some kind of magnification. So here's a fungal hyphae. Here's a bacterial cell. Virus particles, which are very tiny. You can't even see those with optical ways. You have to use scanning electron micrographs. And then here's a nematode. Here's the head of a nematode. Some nematodes you can almost see with your naked eye. It really depends on the nematode. One I don't have here and that people don't think about are parasitic plants. So things like in Wyoming, economic parasitic plants would be dodder and also dwarf mistletoe. And that's one of those things where we get little cross disciplines. The weed scientists also claim those as weeds, as pests and things like that. And so, and also same with nematodes, a lot of entomology departments will lay claim to nematodes. So it really depends on the institution where you'd find an nematologist, either an entomology department or plant pathology, and vice versa. So it's kind of interesting. But for Wyoming, since we're not a super growing paradise all the time.
Wait a minute.
We're not Hawaii.
So that brings a good point about Hawaii or Florida. Which state do you think will have more plant pathogen problems, Hawaii or Wyoming?
I'd say Hawaii.
Now, why
Depends on which island you're talking about.
Why would you say that?
Well, if you're just getting into that temperate rainforest, I think just the higher humidity level, the higher temperatures, the more consistent temperatures and moisture that they receive tend to favor pathogens better, is my speculation.
Right, and you're exactly right. I mean, Wyoming has a pretty short growing season, whereas these more temperate or tropical areas may have growing seasons all year round. They have a lot more, well, I don't know if they have more diverse biota, but they have a lot of plants around, and they have a very humid environment. A lot of these pathogens, when you talk about, especially fungi and bacteria, they really like it wet, and they like it humid. Whereas in Wyoming, we're pretty dry. I mean, so that we only see these pathogens certain times of the year. Or unless you're in a more controlled environment like a greenhouse where the humidities are going to be higher, or even in an agricultural production zone, or in somebody's garden where they may be irrigating daily, or they have a dense canopy, they will probably have elevated humidity levels and things like that. So because of that, we don't see a lot of these pathogens. Also, these pathogens have to have survival strategies for when the plant is not there. So we have long, cold winters. And so certain pathogens aren't going to survive here. Same with insects. I'm sure Jeff could tell us about that. We're not going to have certain insects here because they can't survive the winters. So that brings up non-living factors. Wyoming has pretty harsh winters. So every year I get a deluge of questions about evergreens, because a lot of evergreens will suffer winter damage, winter desiccation, things like that. And so we get a lot of evergreens that are all bleached out, or the needles are dead, and things like that. Well, people will send those in, and it's typically a lot of times, what I'll do is I'll look for diseases usually, and failing to find those a lot of times, we'll just rack it up to harsh environmental conditions. And I'll show some pictures of that here in a little minute of what that looks like. But we especially see this in evergreens, because evergreens, since they are green, they will photosynthesize under the proper conditions, even in the winter. And so Wyoming, we are blessed with a lot of sunlight in the winter. And so if it's in a protected area or something like that, sometimes you'll get microenvironments around that pine needle, and the temperatures will get high enough that those enzymes will start kicking in, and that plant will start trying to photosynthesize. Where the problem is, if your ground is still frozen, the plant can't get enough water to it, and so the plant will start scavenging water from surrounding tissue, and you get a desiccation. So it's fairly simple. It's just a fact of life in terms of growing conifers here.
And then with Wyoming's wind, in addition to that, it just dries those trees out a little further.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, we have, in case you guys haven't noticed, we have a lot of wind here in this state, especially here in Laramie. You know, we're like, especially where I live, we just get hammered with wind. I mean, we're up a little higher. We're east of town of Laramie. So we just get a lot of that wind coming across that continental divide and comes shoveling through that basin area.
I want to know where the wind doesn't blow in Wyoming and maybe move there.
Well,
I heard it was
all the
Hyattville.
Not
Hyattville?
Hyattville, yeah, that's probably
That's
pretty
what somebody
good.
told me.
well, I need to find a place where it doesn't blow as much.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Like when we go to Colorado, sometimes we'll go down to Steamboat for skiing, and sometimes in the winter. And I'll be out there and I'll be like, something's wrong here. What's going on? And then I realize, oh, there's no wind.
I can stand up straight.
Yeah, I don't have to lean over all the time. So what I'm going to do
those
is
abiotic stresses, Bill, those abiotic stresses are considered a plant disease, though. So if it's just Mother Nature wreaking havoc on our plants, that is a part of, it's not only pathogens, I guess is what I'm trying to capture.
Exactly, because these abiotic stressors, whether they are drought or nutrient deficiencies or nutrient excesses or pollutants, things like that, they're all going to interfere with the normal plant processes. And so I'll have a whole slide kind of showing some of those examples. So I only have a few slides. I'm just going to show some of the more common things that I have seen from the clinic. I mean, I'm not a big avid gardener. I do have a garden. I've kind of almost given up on it. I'm sure, Jeff, you've seen a lot more things, and Jeremiah out in the field, but these are some of the things that I have kind of noticed that we have in the state. And one of the first things is seedling diseases. And we typically call this seedling damping off. And they call it damping off because the plant will kind of flop over and it looks, I don't know, damped, I guess. I don't know why they have that term. But a lot of these are due to soil-borne fungal organisms, okay? And what they'll do, some of the symptoms will be as you can see in the bottom here, these plants will just kind of come up and they'll keel over. And if you look at them real close, a lot of times that very thin stem tissue will just become desiccated and will collapse on itself. And then the plant can't get any further nutrients or water to the top part, and the whole thing topples over. Or you might get roots that will rot, or you could get the above tissues starting to rot. Again, it kind of depends on the pathogen. And a lot of these, this can happen in your seed starts, like in your trays, or it can also happen in the field. And so what happens if you're doing seed starts, if you're reusing old potting soil, or the potting soil's been sitting around, or you've contaminated your potting soil somehow by touching other things or the dirty hose, things like that, you can introduce those organisms in there. And a lot of times if your conditions for growth are not great, typically cool and too wet conditions, these pathogens can take advantage of these seedlings. When you plant directly into the soil, a lot of these pathogens are endemic, meaning that they're almost always present in our soils, because a lot of these pathogens, they're like switch hitters. They can go from pathogens to being a saprophyte depending on the conditions. And that makes them more especially difficult to get rid of because they can adopt different lifestyles.
you want to say what a saprophyte is, Bill?
Yeah,
So-
please.
So a saprophyte is any kind of organism that just feeds on dead or decomposing plant tissue. So the plant is already dead and it's just taking advantage of that dead tissue. So they're very, very important in terms of breaking down all of our plants things. Otherwise, we would be overrun with cellulose or things like that with trees because they're not being broken down. And it's very important in terms of all the life nutrients recycling. So there's a lot of saprophytes everywhere.
And a saprophyte is different than a parasite, correct?
So that's a good question. So a parasite, they will go after living organisms, okay? Whereas saprophyte won't. A lot of times the only difference evolutionary wise may be 1 or 2 genes. And it could be that evolutionary wise, there might have been a mutation in that saprophyte allowing it to produce some kind of toxin that allows it to be pathogenic. You know, what separates pathogens from saprophytes a lot of times is just some pathogenicity factor, and that enables them to actually invade a living plant and actually colonize living tissue or actually kill tissue. So usually there's just a few different enzyme systems that differentiate between the two. That's why we get switch hitters. Some of these will actually be able to go both ways.
Okay. Sorry about that rabbit hole, but you know,
Well,
I
and
thought I'd ask.
that probably makes them very difficult, like you're saying, to control or that. So if you do get it in your potting mix in a garden or if you're doing it indoors and starting seeds, that soil is then contaminated with that organism in there, and thus you'll have this dampening off, as an example, every year if you use that soil. Is that correct?
Right. But a lot of times they're only going to do this if the conditions really stress the plants. Okay, so if you have good growing conditions for these seedlings, and of course this is going to vary for what you're planting. You always want to kind of check to see what the ideal temperatures are, but you want to look whatever you're planting and trying to start to make sure that, like if you're planting into the field, you want to make sure that soil is warm enough for that to happen. Now, granted, Wyoming with our crazy weather sometimes, you can't really predict that sometimes. But if you're growing inside, like we've gone to, you can use those warming mats to great effect, which really helps for this, to kind of get the ideal temperatures for those plants and to avoid overwatering. So once you start waterlogging those plants and the temperatures are too cool, they're stressed and they can't fight off these pathogens. A lot of times, once the plant gets up to a certain size, it will resist further attack from these pathogens.
So keeping a healthy plant stock to begin with is your first line of defense for most diseases, maybe is the best way to say it.
To make sure if you're selecting seed that may be not harboring, some of these can be seed-borne, these pathogens, so you want to make sure they don't have that. And also some seed will actually be treated with fungicide.
Yeah.
Especially if you get sweet corn or maybe some beans and things like that. Some of your larger seeds, they'll actually have that colored seed protectant on there, and that will kind of help with this kind of condition.
So Bill, if you have this issue in your soil or your, let's say your potting mix, instead of just throwing it away, if there's an economic loss there, is there something that you can do in order to try to get it under control or not?
Well, you can if you have access to steam and things like that, you can actually pasteurize your soil to reuse it. A lot of greenhouses will do that, like our greenhouse on campus sometimes. They'll try to reuse some of the potting soil by passing steam through it to kill these organisms. Some people have tried using solar, like to cover it, and that will work sort of. And also make sure you clean your pots. Clorox solution, that's really important, and make sure all your tools are clean with Clorox, because you can spread things that way. So there are some things you can do, but a lot of times your best bet is just buy a new potting mix, things like that.
Okay, so you mentioned treating your tools with a bleach solution. Would that be a 1%, 5%, 10%?
10% is a good bet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
And
not
you
straight. Straight's not a good idea.
Heavy
No, don't be
concentration, right?
If you do like a 10% bleach solution, let's say you're cleaning your pots, you want to put them in that solution for like 30 minutes.
Okay.
And then give them a good rinse off to make sure you get that hyperchloride off, and then you're good to go. Okay, so
Great.
that's seedlings. Now the next thing we'll probably see is foliar diseases. And I put some of the more major foliar diseases. So the first one I see a lot of is powdery mildew. And I've got a whole nother slide after this to show a little bit more on that. So I'll touch on that one a little bit more, but let's go on to the rest of the list. Anthracnose, I've seen occasionally up in the right-hand corner. Is that a hosta? I'm not very good with horticulture.
It looks like a hosta.
A hosta plant with some anthracnose. Again, this will cause like a dark lesion. It can go onto some woody tissue, and it's got a pretty wide host range. But a lot of these pathogens, this is like anthracnose is like a generality. There's a lot of different anthracnoses that may have a minor or a very narrow host range. But it is a group, it'll affect a lot of different plants.
And so just for clarification, anthracnose is totally something entirely different than anthrax.
Yeah, right.
Good clarification.
We'll typically see this one early in the spring if there's a lot of moisture and kind of cool temperatures. And we'll see this one. It's actually pretty fun to diagnose because you'll bring these tissue samples in and I put it in the humid chamber and you get a very characteristic fruiting body that really identifies it as anthracnose.
So those cool, wet springs is what we need to be watching for this type of disease to come out.
Like I saw it on an English ivy a couple of springs ago from Casper, and it was kind of a cool, wet spring that year, I remember. Another one we'll see is the wonderful world of rust, which is a pretty unique group of fungi. And again, these are very host specific. This is a goji berry here in the bottom left-hand corner. And fungi will be characteristic, you'll see these little rust pustules. And rust, usually you can kind of wipe it off with your fingers, okay? So if you took a tissue, and if I were to wipe that across that plant surface, you'll see like a dust. And that's real indicative of rust.
A reddish dust.
Orangish red dust, right.
Like some of our wheat will get what we call stripe rust. And I've been through fields, you walk through the fields that have a lot of stripe rust and you'll come out and your jeans are all yellow because the spores have kind of wiped off on your pants. And rusts are kind of unique critters because they're what we call obligate parasites, okay? So there's different strategies that pathogens have. One is a facultative parasite, we have the obligate parasites. They have to have the host living to complete their life cycle. The other ones will just kill everything and then just feed on the stuff after it killed it. They're not much removed from the true saprophytes because they have something that can kill the cells first. But now obligate parasites, they're more evolutionary evolved, I guess. I guess they put on airs, so they're more sophisticated. But they have co-evolved with their hosts a lot more. And so they actively try to keep the host alive as long as they can, basically. And so a lot of times these kind of pathogens don't kill the plant, but they'll definitely hurt it. But they're very much integrated in their relationship with the plant. Also, some of these rusts are very weird because they require, some are, dioecious? They require more than one host to complete their life cycle. And so the host can be completely different. And a good example is cedar apple rust. Mm-hmm. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen cedar apple rust. So it actually affects the juniper in one stage, and then it produces spores, and then those spores then go to apple species. And so if you remove one host from that whole thing, then you don't have a sexual cycle. And so it's very odd that evolutionary-wise, it's kind of gone that route, requiring two totally different plant species. Another one is Hollyhock rust. I got one of those examples one year where the leaf was just covered with rust pustules. And I did a little research on that, and the alternate host for that one was common mallow, which is another common lawn weed. So it would produce one type of spores on the weed that would infect the hollyhock, and then vice versa. So it's a very intricate kind of relationship. So we see those every now and again. We'll see them on grasses, we'll see them on tomatoes, we'll see them on like strawberries, but I don't see them too often. And usually it's not a big issue really, unless we do have some rustitor problems in dry bean production and also in small grains.
Sorry, Bill, the places where I ran into rust the most were in Indiana.
Yeah.
We had it in turf.
Yep.
And also I did a diagnostic thing in a cornfield that was entirely infested with rust. And when we walked out of that field, we were reddish brown. It was just weird to be in that much of a rust infestation.
Yeah, and again, it's due to the higher humidities in those areas. It's more conducive to rust development. Like for us, for stripe rust, there's like narrow windows that will develop every year in the fields and things like that. Like dry beans, we don't have near as much of a rust problem as, say, Colorado does. I don't know why they have so much more problems. I think it's because they have a little bit more slightly humidity down there, and also they have a higher concentration of inoculum because they have a lot more bean fields. Wyoming agriculture is kind of unique, is that we have little islands everywhere. It's like a lot of our production fields are separated physically, and so that's not really great for disease development.
With that rust, those actual pustules on the surface that you're seeing are just the spores. It's not actually the organism, correct?
Right. So what happens on this one, I wish I had a picture I showed to my class of a pustule erupting through the epidermis or the leaf surface. Basically, you'll get a spore, it'll germinate, it goes into the plant, it spreads out the hyphae inside the plant, and then it starts producing spores, and it gets to a point where the spores burst out, kind of like an Alien, where the creature bursts out of your chest.
Kind of like.
Yeah, I always like to use that. I love that movie.
Yeah, of course.
So it's kind of like that. So if you look at this under the microscope, you can actually see the tissue torn of the epidermis of the leaf surface and all these spores spilling out. And then rust spores are typically very colorful. They're real pretty, actually. You'll see red ones, you'll see yellow ones, brick orange ones. Sometimes you'll see black ones. And the reason for that is because their main mode of transportation is through the air, through the atmosphere. And so a lot of rusts are developed to actually be transported hundreds of miles in the atmosphere. And anytime you spend a lot of time in the upper atmosphere, you have to have protection from UV. And so they typically have a lot more pigments. And so there's a lot more pigments in those spores so they can survive that trip. We have a term called the Puccinia highway. A lot of these rusts are on the order Puccinia, and so they for the small grains, they'll travel from Mexico all the way up to the U.S., up into Canada, following wheat production, and so that they call that the Puccinia highway because they just blow in the wind, and so that's why
moving north.
Yeah, and it's very well adapted for that whole agricultural production system.
Crazy. So what's your last point there, Bill?
So alternaria or cercospora leaf spots is another fairly common leaf foliar disease, spotting diseases. Another one's septoria. I didn't put that in there. That's pretty common in a lot of trees. But in a garden, we'll see a lot of alternaria. A lot of times you'll see, it's kind of hard to tell on this one, but you'll see like a target effect as the fungus grows. And a lot of these foliar diseases, all of these included, all have very similar life cycles. We always kind of study the life cycles of these organisms to help predict when they're going to be a problem or how to manage them. And typically a lot of these organisms, with the exception of these rusts, they will survive in this necrotic tissue, okay? So if this leaf, you produce it, it dies, kind of falls on the ground. And if you don't practice good sanitation in your garden by removing this blighted tissue, these things will survive the winter, typically in fungal fruiting bodies. And then the following spring, they'll start producing spores and they'll start the whole cycle over again. And so that's why it's really important to clean up your gardens at the end of the year, to remove all your plant tissue, because that's how these things persist. Now, the problem is if your neighbors don't do that, or the neighbor across the block doesn't do that, those spores can still, if they can, some can travel fair distances in the wind, short periods of time, you can still have a problem. A good example of this is I bought a cherry bush at Walmart. It was on sale, and it was loaded with foliar disease. That's probably what was on sale.
That's probably because why you bought it, right?
Yeah, I figured I could bring it home and nurse it back to health. And I brought it back and I did diagnostics on it, and it was cherry leaf spot, which was kind of cool. And so whenever those leaves, and of course, right away, all the leaves fell off. And I was like, oh my God, I hope this thing, and it's actually doing okay now. But all the leaves fell off, and the leaves were very tiny, and I was trying to pick them all up because I knew that the spores are going to be in those leaves. And I had a choke cherry right next to it as well, which is also a host. And I didn't want that stuff to spread. And I was fairly successful. I didn't get all the leaves, but luckily I didn't have any cherry leaf spot breakout this year. It tends to be okay, and I think my gambit pulled off for my $20 sour cherry bush or whatever.
So like in the vegetable garden, what are you most likely to see alternaria on, and what should folks do about it? Is there anything you can do about it?
So the thing you'll see a lot of alternaria on will be your tomatoes and potatoes, your solanaceous crops. They'll go after those. Cercospora will go like on some peppers and things like that. You know, I don't tend to worry about them too much. Again, if you practice good sanitation, it shouldn't be an issue. The other issue is a lot of these pathogens really like wet conditions on the leaf to be able to establish. So if you're careful with watering, and I know I'm not, but if you have a drip irrigation system that just wets the soil, your plant tissue is going to be pretty dry, and that's really good to avoid a lot of pathogen infections. When you're watering the leaves and things like that, and let's say you water in the evening, so the leaves will stay wet even longer throughout the night, those create what we call infection courts, or areas where you'll get infection occurring. So a lot of it's just prevention. And a lot of times, you know, if it gets really bad, you know, once it starts getting bad or sees bad like this, I don't really recommend spraying because a lot of times the damage has already been done. The only time I recommend people spray is if they have a reoccurring problem year after year after year. Then I say, yeah, it might be useful to spray a fungicide, but just sporadic outbreaks like that, I typically don't worry about it too much. If the plant gets too bad, you might want to just rogue it out and get rid of it because it's an inoculum source.
Okay, so if people are overhead watering, then if they overhead water in the morning and it has time to evaporate by the time night rolls around, that's probably a good approach to help avoid it.
Probably water in the morning, not toward the evening. Same with lawns too. And same with trees. You know, people can adjust their lawn sprinklers sometimes to not maybe contact the leaves, so they're getting wet all the time. You know, just keeping a dry environment really helps. Also in the garden, maybe don't be so overly ambitious by a lot of planting in there, because by the time the season rolls around, you're going to get a very dense canopy in there. And that really creates a lot of these microenvironments where you do get a lot of diseases showing up. A lot of these diseases I'll typically see toward the end of the production season because those gardens are so big.
So they get more humid when they have more leaves and more water coming off the leaves.
And that's really the case with this one, powdery mildew. I typically will get samples submitted toward late summer, early fall, when those canopies and those gardens are getting really full. The air is kind of stagnant. The light levels are a little lower. You don't get as much light penetration. And that's when you start getting powdery mildew. So
before we go into that one, Bill, real quick, can you jump back on your slide? One thing I guess I always share with my clients is with fungicides, it's kind of a misnomer. Like we think of herbicides and things like that, and they actually kill what they're targeting. But with fungicides, they're usually more of a preventative measure than they are of killing. So once you have a fungus attack your plant, that fungicide is not going to go in and kill that fungus outright. Not in every situation.
Excellent point. This is why Jenny pays you the big bucks.
He wishes.
True. So, and this is a hard concept for like my students to kind of digest, and I always have these graphs and tables and things like that. But let's take, for example, this picture here. And so what a client may do is like, oh my God, I got huge fungal outbreak. They run to the store, buy fungicide, spray it, and then it gets worse. And they like freak out. And so what's happening is when you see this is called visible disease. It's not total disease. And so we have a latency period. It's kind of like with our current pandemic. When you look at a cross population, you may only see a few that are sick or in the hospital, but there's a lot of other people that may have it but haven't shown any symptoms yet. Same way with pathogens. You know, there's what we call the latency period. So as soon as that spore or bacterial infection takes place, there may be a number of days before you even see a symptom. And so when a person gets to this point, this could be only a tip of the iceberg how much disease is actually there. And so growers have a real problem with this as well, is they'll go out and they're like panic because they'll actually start to notice disease from their truck as they drive by at 40 miles an hour. And by then it's too late. Right. And so they'll run out and contract a plane to spray it, and it gets worse. Like, what's going on? Well, a lot of times you may only be seeing a very small portion of the disease. There may be a lot more disease than that that's going to come on a week later. And the fungicides you mentioned is true. Most of the ones that homeowners are going to buy, there's two types. There's what we call protectants and systemics. Protectant fungicides, they've been around for a long time. You spray them on the leaf, they form a chemical barrier on the leaf surface, and they prevent new spores from germinating. So if you already have an infection on that leaf, those chemicals have no effect whatsoever. Okay, so it's only going to prevent new infections. So if you've got a diseased tissue there, it's going to stay. And you'll probably see more because of the latency. So that's why people get freaked out, because they'll say, well, the disease keeps getting worse, and then they go back to the garden center and complain and blah, blah, blah. But they don't understand how the pesticide works. Now there's another class called systemics, which actually penetrates the plant. And depending on the chemical, they can move a little bit in the plant. Mm-hmm. And those ones, some of them will kill recent infections, like several days old.
Yeah. So if you catch it early enough, like
those ones can reduce overall disease, but they're not going to catch all of them. You're still going to see it.
Right.
So you always want to spray before you start seeing stuff. And
so it's a preventative measure, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't recommend people spray all the time, just prophylactically, as a preventative. I would, if you establish that there's a problem every year, then it might be beneficial to spray. And you look at the label, and it may, let's say you're spraying for a foliar pathogen on a fruit tree or something. Like I got a sample of, what was it? It was from Casper. Well, it was a picture. And it looked like either apple scab or cedar apple rust. I couldn't really tell from the picture. But when you look at the spray recommendations, you're supposed to spray when the buds are just starting to flower, and then you spray for several weeks after that. So you don't wait for the disease to occur. So usually if you have an established problem year after year, that's when you want to do that.
Right.
You know,
So
back to this example.
some of the vegetable varieties I've seen ones that list different diseases on the like seed packets and stuff that they're supposed to be resistant to. I suppose that could be approached if you have a recurrent problem every year with vegetables where you're replanting each year.
Yeah, resistant varieties are always the preferred first line of defense. Again, if you have a reoccurring problem year after year, let's say you plant a shrub and you keep getting the same disease year after year, you should either quit planting that shrub or look for resistant varieties of that particular disease, because a lot of times that's going to be the best way to prevent the disease. Now, also note that resistances comes in different levels. Usually resistance doesn't mean immunity. It's kind of like, you know, you get a flu shot and you get the right strain, but it does confer some protection against the flu, so you may not get as sick. Same with a lot of these resistant plants. They're resistant enough to slow down the disease. The disease, not as many infections take place. If it does infect, it may not grow as fast, or it may not produce as many spores. So it basically slows down the whole, it flattens the curve that you hear all the time in the news.
Right. So before we move,
a lot of plants have different levels of that.
Right. So before we move on to powdery mildew, Bill, I also want to ask a question from Facebook. Stephanie asks, she has some white blotches on my yellow squash leaves. It's not hampering their growth, but they are they needing something? Are the plant needing something, or is that a bacteria or a pathogen? And why I bring that up now is just with this leaf spot. Just because there's spots on the leaves, is it a pathogen?
Not always. It could be just it could be insect injury. It could be sun scald or sun injury, things like that. It's not always, or just injuries. Some nutrient deficiencies can spot spots. Of course, that one sounds like powdery mildew.
That's what it sounded like to me.
So let's move on to powdery mildew then.
So powdery mildew is kind of a fun. It's also an obligate parasite. It's kind of fun because it only parasitizes the first few layers of cells of the plant leaf. So it rarely kills a plant, okay? It makes it look like crap, basically, especially if you're trying to grow roses or something like that. And also, if you get it strong enough, it's gonna reduce that plant's ability to photosynthesize, obviously, if you got all that white stuff on there. So sometimes you can see necrosis. Here you can see some necrosis starting on this leaf. And so this is a squash plant. Squash plants are very susceptible to powdery mildew. Like I have a penstemon that grows in my backyard, kind of wild now, and it's very susceptible to powdery mildew. I get powdery mildew in it every year. And one thing I've got to tell you about powdery mildew is there's a lot of different species. It's like they may be in the same genus. So they're fairly host specific. So if you were in a garden and you see your melon developing powdery mildew and you think it might spread to all your other different plants, that's usually not the case. What it is indicative of is that your conditions are right for powdery mildew to grow. And if those other powdery mildews are around, they may infect your plants. But typically, it's not a problem for it's not going to spread to other plants, is what I'm trying to say. Because usually the powdery mildew that's on here, it's not going to go to this dandelion and vice versa. So here's a dandelion from my yard. And this particular dandelion is by a fence and there's a lot of shade there. And so it might be a little bit more humid environment because on the other side of the fence, I actually water every day because I've got some struggling raspberries. And so it's kind of in a condition where it's going to get some powdery mildew on it. But again, that's very specific probably to that plant. So I actually have a lab from my class where I bring in different powdery mildews and they'll look at the fruiting structure. So this is a close-up. These plants don't have any fruiting structures on it yet. When they do, you'll see these little balls. And you can see these with your naked eye. And they'll do different colors, black or yellow or orange, depending on their stage of, how mature they are. And I actually will have them investigate these under the microscope because they have these little appendages, and some are curled, some are straight, some don't have any appendages. And if you burst them open, you can see the spores, and some will have a certain different number of spores. And you can actually go through and identify them on a diagnostic key on what family they belong to. So it's kind of a really, from a teaching standpoint, it's kind of fun to play with.
So for our question from Facebook, do you have some suggestions to that individual about their squash leaves, about trying to reduce the humidity or things along that line?
Yeah, I mean, if you can, it's hard to go in there and remove plant tissue in your garden, but if you got stuff that's overcrowding, you may want to trim it up a little bit. Now, before I say anything, I want to say something about powdery mildew. It's very unique in terms of fungi. Powdery mildew does not like free water on the leaves, okay? And I was a little surprised at this. It was actually a Purdue bulletin said that, yeah, if you sprinkle the water on the leaves and keep them wet all the time, that'll reduce powdery mildew, which is true, because free water is toxic to powdery mildew spores for some reason.
Huh.
All the other fungi, they love free water, but this particular class of fungus don't like it. And so I can't really recommend people use that as a control measure, because then you open up the door to all other kind of pathogens. So I was really surprised that the Purdue Bulletin let that kind of slide. But in terms of controlling it, again, sanitation is key to make sure you clean up all that stuff so you don't have any residues the following year. If you can get rid of these, you can really greatly reduce your powdery mildew problems. I mean, those spores can travel a little bit of distance, but not that far. They're pretty big spores.
So get rid of maybe the leaves that have the most powdery mildew on them. That wouldn't be too many leaves that would sacrifice the plant.
Yeah, you could remove it, or the case where she had a few spots coming on, you could even take a horticultural oil, or I don't know, a little bit of soap and water, just kind of wipe it off. Because it'll probably grow back, but at least kind of keep it at bay. And if the leaf gets really bad like these, you might want to just remove them from there. There are chemical controls, but again, I don't really advocate a lot of fungicide use in gardens, especially for stuff you're eating. I would go for some of the more non-toxic things like horticultural oils, neem oils. Some people use anti-transparents. They're all going to be marginal in terms of effectiveness.
Right, but then at the end of the season, then remove all of that biomass of that plant that was affected by powdery mildew to stop it from spreading to next year's plant growth.
Right, because what happens, these little balls, on that dead leaf will fall to the soil surface, and then the following spring, when the moisture gets high enough, they'll split open, and then those spores will go flying out.
Sure.
So what do you have? What do you have? Rapid development of disease, because when you see this white stuff, what you're seeing is this is actually a sign of the pathogen. You actually physically see the pathogen. There's tons of tiny little asexual spores, and that's how it spreads during the year. These ones down here are the resting spores or sexual spores.
Okay. So what do you have next for us, Bill?
Root and vascular diseases. So I'll see these every now and again too. And these can be caused by bacteria or fungi. And a root disease is something where the pathogen actually attacks the root, okay? So anytime you attack the root, you're gonna see effects above plant because it can't get proper water and nutrients. So you'll see typically a situation like this where the plant is unthrifty, wilting, necrosis, things like that. A vascular disease is when the plant, the pathogen actually gets in the vascular tissue, whether it be the xylem or the water conducting elements or the phloem, which are the nutrient conducting elements. The pathogen actually gets in those tissues and parasitizes that, physically blocking them, again causing a wilt. A good way to diagnose these is this picture right here. So what is real striking about this for you guys?
It's one plant in the middle.
Looks
Yeah,
bad.
one plant. So these other plants look nice and healthy. So if all the plants look like this and the ground was dry, then you go like, well, the guy's not watering. But here, these plants are obviously healthy. They're getting enough nutrients, they're getting enough water, but this plant is not. And so when you see that, you know something's wrong with either its root system or vascular tissue, because otherwise it shouldn't behave like that. For some of these vascular tissues, if you cut a diagonal slice through that stem, and here's where the vascular tissue is in this woody tissue, you can see that it is discolored. And you'll see that in tomatoes too. You can just, like I told you, in that they should just cut that slice, and you'll see that brown discoloration in those tomatoes if you've got some kind of vascular tissue. And it's usually either a verticillium wilt or a fusarium. We'll see this also on woody trees. Like I've seen some verticillium on ash trees. But here's where it gets complicated. Ash trees, unfortunately, don't show this symptom. So it's very frustrating when I try to, because that one you actually have to try to coax the verticillium out of the plant tissue, which is not easy, or try to look for it in the soil. And the problem is when you get verticillium in your areas, that one's hard to get rid of because, again, it's pretty endemic in the soil. And like let's for example, let's say this is verticillium, and let's say it was affecting a lot of different plants. I would recommend, again, getting rid of all that plant tissue, because that's how it's gonna, you know, the spores, it's gonna develop spores within that plant tissue.
Including the roots.
Yeah, well, mostly in the vascular tissue, but also in the roots. So as that plant, and maybe it's incorporated in the soil, starts to decay, it releases that inoculum. And so I would get rid of those plants. But if you've got a lot of these plants in there, I would recommend don't grow tomatoes in there for a couple of years, you know, maybe 3 years to get rid of that stuff. This one here, these are dry beans, and this is probably either a Rhizoctonia or Fusarium, again, a pretty common root and stem pathogen. And I had a student work on that one as well, and it was kind of an interesting study because dry beans are really interesting because they can tolerate a lot of that and still produce a pretty good yield. And so, like, if I'll go to a farmer's field and this was actually Kyle's dad up there.
Yeah.
And we were looking at his bean field, and they go, "What's your rotation scheme?" He goes, "I've been growing beans here for like 5 years straight." I'm like, "Oh God." We go out there and pull up the plants, and they all look like that.
Yep.
But the problem is he was getting great yields still. And so we had Kyle do that research, and we found that, yeah, we're getting a lot of almost 100% infection rate of this disease, but it didn't seem to matter. So certain plants can actually compensate for that. For
Was it due to the variety of beans he was growing?
No, well, we looked at we had 5 different varieties, and the variety that got the disease the most still yielded the most, and that was that Orthello.
Wow.
Othello.
Well, and it just might be, there is a period in there, if you stress a plant just enough, and it's a very small window, very tight window, you'll actually see a yield increase because of that stress to that plant. And so this disease is just not killing the plant, but it's stressing it just enough, and they're taking care of that plant, and it's growing through that disease, but yielding very well, possibly because of that stress.
See, this is why you'd be a good football coach. You get those kids running in this hot weather like this, they'll get stronger. Yes, that's very true. And we see that what these plants will do too is they'll produce a lot more axillary roots to compensate for those main tap roots dying off.
It seems like these have a couple of the diseases I often see on vegetable descriptions that it might have a little bit of resistance to one or the other. Do you see that very often?
Yes, not so much on these ones. We had a hard time finding any varieties that had resistance. more of a tolerance. But there are verticillium resistant varieties like in tomatoes and things like that. So again, if you've had a known problem and you want to grow tomatoes, then look for some resistant varieties. And a lot of times that's listed on the tag when you buy them.
Yep.
Unfortunately, you'll have to probably go to a better garden supply store typically than say Walmart. Walmart just gets whatever. And I notice a lot of the Walmart plants don't really list a lot of the resistances that the plants may have. Whereas if you go to a more better garden center or a greenhouse, they may.
Yeah, or you can grow your own and then you can choose what you will.
Right.
Hey.
But that brings up another point too. I'll see issues with tomato plants and I always ask, well, where are you getting the plants? And sometimes they're getting them from their neighbors. and maybe that's not a good idea sometimes too, because you might be inheriting problems. Some of these diseases can be seed-borne, where, you know, it kind of transfers with a plant, or the plant have the disease already and you're just planting it and have a built-in problem sometimes. So that's one thing we always say, make sure you've got good, clean planting material. If you're taking your neighbor's stuff, you're taking a gamble.
Now we have a question in our Zoom here from Chris, and it says morning glory leaf edges are rolling up, especially on the upper portion of the plant. Do you have any idea on that one?
Is this the new tissue then, I assume?
I would assume the new tissue on the top portion of the plant.
My first question is, well, is that normal in morning glories? I don't know.
I see it on bindweed a lot, but it's due to drought on bindweed is where I've seen the curling.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got water issues or if it's hot and the plant can't keep up with it, the stuff the furthest from the roots are going to start getting affected first. So it
might not be, so it's a plant disease, but just might be abiotic.
Yeah,
and we might just need to irrigate more, possibly.
Yeah, and even sometimes, and I'll cover this, we would call like leaf scorch, where sometimes even though you keep watering a plant, if it's really hot and windy, the plant just can't keep up, and that could be the case with that.
Yeah.
So like Jeff this weekend, when he's hitting 105 degrees or whatever they're supposed to get, they could maybe see that if that was extended for a long period of time.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Great. Well, and it also, I'll just throw out there also, there are certain insects that will do leaf rolling as well. So it's not a cut and dry thing. And so, you know, that's where that plant diagnostic center that you guys do is so beneficial, because we can get multiple specialists in on it to look at it from those angles. But pictures and knowing what the background information on it would help.
Right, and you bring up a good point. A diagnosis is only as good as the material that we're provided. So a lot of times people will send pictures. Well, you know, picture doesn't always tell 1,000 words. If you have the physical specimen, you can actually look under the microscope. And a lot of times I'll discover, hey, well, there's a mite here or an insect causing the problem. Whereas you're not going to tell that in a photo a lot of times. And so the more information you have, the better we're going to be able to solve the crime, if you will.
Right.
You know, basically like any kind of detective work, the more information you have and evidence you have, the better a job we're going to be able to do.
Right. And for us, the clearer the picture, right?
Yeah,
so if the client can't tell what's in the picture, we definitely won't be able to tell. So really nice, crisp, clean, clear pictures really help us out. So,
which is hard to do a lot of times in cell phones, especially if you're out in the sun. And if you're like me, if you're not wearing your bifocals, I can't really tell if it's in focus or not. And so, yeah, it's hard sometimes to take good pictures, especially if the stuff's up in a tree canopy or something.
A distance
like
away,
I got a bunch of just very blurry apple
those
tree
are fun.
photos.
Those are way fun.
Wind doesn't help either.
No.
So what do you have next, Bill?
The next we got viruses. And so I don't like viruses because they're so tiny. You can't see them. They're really difficult to diagnose. There's a lot of viruses out there. and some viruses have really, really wide host range. You know, like some viruses can infect like 3 different plant families. I mean, it's amazing how some are very adaptive, whereas some viruses are very specific to particular varieties. And so almost all our virus problems, since these are tiny, they're just basically pieces of genetic code. They're either RNA or DNA encapsulated in a protein code. I mean, they're very simple. They're not living from that strict standpoint. And so they require some kind of vector to move them into the plant. And it's typically an insect. The big ones are the aphids, leafhoppers are probably the main ones that'll vector a lot of our viruses. There are a few that can be vectored physically, like for the dirty, contaminated equipment, your tobacco mosaic viruses. They're kind of an exception. You know, we always hear about the research, how long the COVID virus is going to last on a surface. And I don't know, what is it, like a day maybe or something like that. And other viruses maybe only last half an hour or an hour. It depends, again, how that virus is constructed. The tobacco mosaic virus, it can persist for 40 years on a shovel. You know, it's really, for some reason, it's very resistant to breakdown. But for the most part, most of our viruses, yeah, they're not going to stick around that long. And so they have to be moved around and physically introduced into the plant by these insects.
So you're going to be looking at insects that have more of a piercing, sucking mouth part that actually penetrates the stem or the leaf cuticle of the plant to inject that virus, correct?
Right, and those ones are perfect ways to introduce a virus, because a virus has to be introduced into a living cell. So if you've got and I'm going to butcher this, Jess, is it malphagus beetles?
Sound good to me.
Yeah, sure.
Well, the ones that have chewing mouth parts.
Melophagus?
Melophagus. So if there are a few beetles that will vector viruses, but typically if they're chewing and totally destroying a cell, it's not a good way to introduce it. Whereas these insects are actually piercing with their little hypodermic needle mouths, and same with nematodes. It's an ideal way to introduce viruses.
Are there certain symptoms on plants that make you suspect it's a virus? Most commonly.
Here's a couple of symptoms. So a lot of times, it looks like herbicide injury a lot of times. Like if we see a lot of twisting, and here you can see twisting and curling, some necrosis, the plant is stunted. Here's a healthy tomato plant. Here's one infected with beet curly top. Here you can see what we call a mosaic pattern is pretty common with viruses, where you'll see alternating normal tissue and yellow tissue. Sometimes the tissue will be kind of puckered and rough shaped. It's kind of like when you take a piece of aluminum foil and you do that and it gets all crinkly and stiff. Same way with some of these leaves, they'll have a stiff appearance to it. And I'm not really totally sure why that is, but I think it may have to do how the virus moves around in the plant, because it will move cell to cell, but it's very slow, but it moves very quickly in the transpirational stream. So I think within a given leaf, sometimes you'll have uninfected tissue and then infected tissue, just because the virus hasn't moved around that much.
And that thickening area is probably more the infected area, I would suspect.
Well, again, it's the way the plant's kind of growing, and it gets that corrugated effect, and it'll affect the texture of it.
And that so on this mosaic, that's where we see a lot of similar to herbicide damage. So if they just got a little drift of a herbicide, especially a growth regulator, you'll see a puckering, maybe a little mosaic pattern. Could insects possibly do this mosaic pattern too?
Yeah, like a mite can do that sometimes. Yeah. Because again, they're like a piercing, sucking mouth part, and multiple attacks along that leaf can do that. A good trick to tell between herbicide injury and maybe a viral injury, herbicide is going to be more widespread, and it may involve many different plant species. That's always a great indication of herbicide injury, because most of these viruses, they may not have that wide a host range, and they may not have that wide of a net. Like you could find one infected plant and a bunch of normal plants around it. That's usually a good indication it could be virus. Whereas if it was a herbicide injury, all those plants in that vicinity would be affected usually.
Yeah. So in preventing the viruses, since it's mostly vectored by something, it needs to be a vector. If we control that vector point, we control the virus to a degree.
You can, but controlling a lot of these insects are very difficult. So there's only a few production scenarios where controlling the vector actually works. One is Pierce's disease in grapes, where they tried to control the, was it the glassy wing shooter or something like that?
Yeah, the shooter. Yep. Sharpshooter.
Yeah, so
thank you, Jimmy.
They've had good luck by controlling those insects to managing that disease, but for these other ones, it's tougher. So for example, beet curlytop. So here's one thing. When they name viruses, it's usually the first major crop or plant that they identify the virus in. So for this, when you see this name beet curlytop, you know, okay, it affects beets for sure. The symptom usually is included in the naming scheme as well. So it's curlytop. So again, you see kind of a curliness to the plant. This one's tobacco, oh no, tomato spotted, oops, dang it. Spotted wilt virus on pepper. So again, that tells you, okay, well, you know the host is tomato, but you don't know what all the other hosts are going to be. And it could be a spotted wilt. So this one doesn't even show spots yet, but that particular disease, if it goes long enough, you'll see little necrotic spots on it. So sometimes the virus name is indicative of what the host is and what kind of symptoms you might expect. But also it doesn't tell you what the other host may be.
Right.
Okay, I went down that rabbit hole. What were we talking about before?
Well, just control of viruses. So in this, once the plant dies and it's there in the garden, you don't need to necessarily maybe remove that plant tissue because it usually needs living tissue to survive, correct?
Right, but you want to remove it because this plant is a reservoir of virus to reinfect this plant.
For its neighbors.
So if you have an insect visit this, and some insects are attracted to sick-looking plants, they'll pick up the virus and they can potentially transmit it to this one.
Right.
So
try and keep healthy plant stock again.
Right. So if you see an infected plant like that, I always recommend sacrificing it and get rid of it. Now, for this particular disease, this I think it's the beet leafhopper. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
The beet leafhopper. So they really it prefers weeds. And so in the spring, that's just why growers, if they can plant their beets early enough, the leafhopper is still happily munching on weeds. And then if the beet gets to a certain size, it's more resistant to that problem. If the grower waits too long to plant his beets, by the time, a lot of these weeds are, they're mustards, so they're winter annuals. So they're going to start drying off and desiccating by early summer. And so then those leafhoppers will look for a new food source. And if there's a new beet planted field there, then they can transmit the virus there. So one way to control it too is to remove those weeds.
Right.
And we always recommend in gardens to reduce a lot of the weeds around your gardens because weeds can serve as alternate hosts for a lot of these diseases. Like if you have a lot of, I always tell growers, yeah, you can do crop rotation, try to get rid of some of these diseases. But if you don't control some of these weeds in your following crop, that disease can persist in that weed.
Yeah.
And so a good example of that one was alfalfa, no, not alfalfa, sugar beet cyst nematode. You know, it will infect some of those common weeds you see in beet fields. And if they don't control those weeds the following year, those nematodes can persist until you go back into beets. So, that's another way to do it. And the other one is you can just, if it's a common problem, again, year after year, you can look for resistant varieties. Certain varieties will have some resistance to these viruses.
Great. What's next, Bill?
Okay, my favorite, the abiotic disorders. It's my favorite because this is probably 60% or more, maybe 70% of my samples I get into the clinic are probably due to abiotic disorders. But of course, they may say, well, Dr. Stump, that's just your fallback position because you can't find anything, which could be. But for the most part, if we can't find a proof of some kind of biotic pathogen, we typically have to rely on abiotic disorders. And we're probably right most of the time. And here's some very common examples. So abiotic disorders are, again, something, the environmental growing conditions aren't up to speed, something's not right, and so the plant is going to suffer. This could be nutrient imbalances, which we have a lot in Wyoming, especially if people try to grow, say, aspens in cities where we have high pH soils, we get iron chlorosis every year. Laramie is really bad for this. I'm sure you guys are too.
Yep.
Where people try to grow aspen as landscaping plants and then wonder why their plants are all yellow and sometimes necrotic toward the end of the season. And it's because if our soils are pushing 8+ pH, iron is not very available, so the plant can't get enough, and therefore it suffers. Now, because when, aspens normally grow up in the mountains, right? And there's a lot more rainfall up there, so you have more acidic soils because of that rainfall. We also have a lot of salts in our soils, so that can cause nutrient imbalances. Or if people just aren't providing enough fertilizer, you get, nitrogen deficiencies or phosphorus deficiencies. Again, the plant can't function normally, and it's going to manifest itself in a kind of a disease. Of course, a big one in Wyoming is cold injury. We see this every year. A good example here, here's a aspen tree that we get those spring freezes all the time. Like Mother's Day, it always snows here on Mother's Day.
Right.
And we get a lot of cold temperatures. So we had in April, I think it was middle of April, like the 20th, it was like in the teens here. And we saw a lot of tissue damage, a lot of bud damage. The trees hadn't opened yet, but the buds were killed. And so when the plants start resuming growth, I have a lot of tree samples this year that just don't have any leaves on them because the buds were all killed. So that's a big one. Wind injury. Well, and also snow. We had that big snow. When was that?
June sometime.
Yeah, we had lost all those tree branches, because all the trees already leafed out. And so then boom, they just couldn't take it. And so you get a lot of injury. And so those injuries will also cause problems down the road in terms of other fungal organisms getting in those injuries. Water stress is a big one. This is what we call up here, this is a maple, I believe. We call this leaf scorch. And again, this is where the tree or the plant can't keep up with water relations, so it's typically very hot, a lot of hot winds. The plant can't keep up with water demands. The plant starts taking water from cell tissue around it, and it starts desiccating from the edge in. And certain species are more susceptible to this than others. Maples are pretty susceptible. I've seen it on narrowleaf cottonwoods. We've seen it on plants in the garden as well, where the plant just can't keep up with water demands. Heat stress too, we start seeing this, especially in tomatoes now. Like those pictures, some of that could be heat stress, especially if there's something maybe compromised with that root system. And then here is my Austrian pine, where again, these needles desiccated during the winter. And people always wonder, because you don't start seeing the necrosis until, like June, or late May, when the plant starts growing. And I think it's because just like your Christmas tree, you cut it and bring it into the house, it stays green for like a month. Same way with this tissue, it stays green for a month, even though it may be dead. And then finally it starts becoming necrotic. And so a lot of people think they have needle cast diseases and things like that, but it's usually a pretty simple test once we get in the clinic to kind of tell that. If it's needle cast, they'll have little fruiting bodies on those needles. If it's diastroma or whatever, you'll see these tips are greatly reduced, things like that. But if you look at this, these needles on the end are still looking normal. So it wasn't diastroma, and I couldn't find any fruiting bodies on these. So this is just a really good example of this tissue just desiccated during the winter.
Yep.
And I'll probably have to go back in there and trim that stuff out.
Part of life of living in Wyoming.
Exactly.
Wyoming's good at stress, right?
Yeah,
it just stresses every plant we have.
And a lot of people always think they're watering enough, but they're not usually. And a good example is like if you go, like you make a client call or something like that, Jeremiah, so take one of those big long screwdrivers and see if you can plunge it into their soil to see if you can get it in there. Because, you know, people are, and I still see this all the time, especially if they establish trees with drip irrigation,
Right.
but then they leave it in there.
Yep.
That is not enough for a mature plant. And, or that, well, we just have it on the sprinkler system for the lawn. A lot of times that's that frequent, shallow irrigation. It's not enough for these trees. Some of them, they need more deep penetrating waterings. Like I try to water my trees, you know, a couple times a month with a hose, just leaving that hose on there and really soaking that ground. Because infrequent watering doesn't cut it sometimes. And especially drip irrigation.
Yeah. Drip irrigation is really beneficial. It's very efficient with that water, but it can be too efficient, right? If we're not managing that irrigation system properly, we might not be putting enough water down.
And I see a lot of this. This year we had a client. He lived outside of Kurt Gowdy State Park, and he had a huge setup with all these trees, you know, like windbreaks, because he's out on the kind of on the prairie, and so he had tons of trees, a lot of Austrian pines, spruces, things like that, basically windbreaks, and he had a lot of, you know, this desiccation going on. And we started looking, and he had drip irrigators and things like that, and they just weren't putting out enough water. And this happens a lot with these landscapes, especially these wind blocks or these windbreaks. As they start becoming mature, they're crowding each other and they're big, and they're not getting enough water. And we're seeing a lot of our windbreaks now starting to lose trees, just because, you know, they were densely planted to begin with because they're trying to block wind, but now they're starting to get too big and they're competing with each other. And if they still have the drip irrigation, it's just not enough.
Yep.
You know, and this same way with this guy. And it was kind of interesting. Google Earth has become real handy too, because I got his address and I put it in Google Earth. And so I can see the satellite image of this big spread of all these trees. And I could tell, you know, he wasn't in the tree zone, you know, like around Gowdy and those areas, you get these pockets of trees and things like that. He is more out in the prairie, so which indicates they're not getting as much moisture and things like that. And so I could tell right away, well, he's just not getting enough moisture. So they're going to change their irrigation practices now, and hopefully that helps.
Yeah,
sure. What else, Bill? We're about to the end here, I think.
I think this is my last slide. And so in terms of management, we've already touched on a lot of this stuff. And I put in this USDA plant hardiness zone map because proper plant selection is really key when you get these plants and try to plant it. Because when I go to Walmart, they don't really, they have these big distribution centers, and they have the one in Cheyenne. You know, Cheyenne's a little bit more friendly in terms of growing stuff, but so they base all their plants on that. And then all the surrounding Walmarts get plants from those distribution centers. And so I'll see plants in their selections that are USDA zone maybe 5.
right.
And whereas we're in Laramie is probably, what, 3 or 4?
4.
I think
We're lucky.
probably-
4. And I'm guessing we have different microenvironments, like my location, because of the wind intensity is probably more like a 4 or 3.5 or whatever the hell they do these, 3B or whatever. And so you have to be really careful and know your location when you select plants. Are these going to be hardy enough? Because a lot of times if the plant's not well adapted, it ain't going to do well, and it's going to suffer. It's going to be in stress. It's either going to die outright from cold injury, or it's going to be so stressed out that other opportunistic pathogens are going to take it out.
I always think it's especially critical for those plants that leave their plant parts above ground during the winter, and so they're exposed to the wind and everything, whereas the ones that die back to the ground, they got a little bit of buffer with the soil.
Yeah, exactly. Like I always try to make sure my strawberries have a nice bed of snow on it because I notice I lose a few of those every year.
Yeah.
Because I'm not protecting them, and they're in a raised bed too. And
so I was experimenting a little bit last year. I found a fig that is supposed to be zone 5, a fig tree, and it all died back, but it came back. It's a bush, and I expect that to be the case every year.
And you can kind of play the odds sometimes, especially if you have microenvironments like a south-facing wall, or if it's protected, you can sometimes be a little bit more cautious in terms of your plant hardiness. But man, I found on some of mine, I need like tundra flowers. It's like, awful. And I have a very droughty soil where, I'm up above, that big hollow was I forget the technical geological term, but it was actually a wind scavenged basin. And so up against the Laramie Mountains, we have a lot of sand. And it was also an ocean, a shallow sea, so we have a lot of sand and limestone. So my soil is probably 75% sand. And so the water just runs through it.
Right.
So I have to have pretty drought tolerant plants. If it requires a lot of water, like I had an aspen tree, didn't even last the first year. It just did not get enough
Not
water.
enough water. Yeah.
So you already talked about sanitation. That's pretty important, it seems like, in a lot of these disease problems. Is that correct?
Yeah, just kind of cleaning up, because if you want to upset that life cycle of that pathogen. So if it overwinters in plant tissue, which a lot of these do, if you remove that plant tissue, you can remove that inoculum source. But again, I mean, you can get it coming from outside, but the more you can take steps to reduce inoculum load, the better off you're going to be in terms of reducing disease. Just kind of like wearing a mask reduces, it's not going to get rid of everything, but if you reduce a lot of those aerosol droplets and things like that, you can definitely reduce the amount of disease you're going to have. And then smart watering, all I mean by that is, avoid wetting foliage excessively, using the proper irrigation. Like a drip irrigation in a garden is great a lot of times because those emitters are producing enough water for these annuals or smaller plants. But for larger landscapings like trees and things like that, you may want to start thinking twice about relying on your drip irrigation entirely.
Watering at the correct time of day can also help with that too. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, a lot of times people can get away with it. Like a lot of people in my neighborhood water at night, their lawns and stuff like that, which usually is fine in Laramie. I mean, it's so dry here, but like if I was in the Midwest, I probably wouldn't do that because you'll probably get a lot more fungal diseases in your lawns. So.
But like in your drought soils, like you were saying, watering at night, it's kind of maybe a way of holding that moisture a little bit longer in that soil, so it's more useful. It's just specific for your soil type in your area.
Yeah. And then overcrowding is another one. A lot of people, and I did the same thing, especially when, like I did landscaping from scratch. We built our house here. And so you want to fill all those gaps in with plants. And then sometimes the plants do survive here, and all of a sudden I've got this dwarf crabapple jammed up against a mugo pine, and I'm like, oh my God, one of these two are gonna have to go. And I have constant arguments with my wife in the backyard because we want to plant trees to screen out our neighbors, and I'm like, well, you can't plant them close together. I mean, they're gonna get big. It's gonna take forever anyway. Will you be dead by then? Which is probably true, but But in your garden, especially an annual garden, you do have some say on that. Really go by those guidelines when they say plant 4 inches apart, things like that. Don't try to jam them in there, because again, you're going to create a microenvironment that's more conductive to disease problems. And then roguing troublemakers, we had talked about that already. Like if a plant looks like it's have a virus issue, or if it's got a lot of fungal disease on it, things like that. Maybe consider having that one sacrificing itself for the team. It's like, get rid of it so it's not going to spread to other plants.
Right.
Again, that's a hard call. Sometimes certain plants you can kind of nurse along and still produce some stuff, and you might be okay. And then pesticides, of course, I always put a question mark. I never really advocate a lot of use in home gardens. There are a few conditions where it does help, especially if they have constant problems every year. So like going back to that goji berry with Leroy, he had that rust problem every year. And I could not find any information about that rust. I think it's not native to the US or something. And in fact, I had a Chinese grad student look in some of the literature in China, because goji berry is from Asia. And he did find some obscure references to a goji rust, but no information. So I don't have no idea if it requires an alternate host or not, but we recommend, well, just try a preventative fungicide every year. And he did that for a couple of years, and the problem kind of went away. So, in that case, maybe, it's justified, especially if he's in a commercial situation or he's growing a lot of goji berry.
Well, my recommendation would be just to take the goji berries out.
Are goji berries not trendy anymore? I can't even remember.
Oh, I'm sure they're trendy, but they're just not very tasty. So
they're a tough
they're so
plant.
good for you, Jeff.
Oh, well, yeah, but just because it's good for me doesn't mean I need to eat it.
So I always recommend more green pesticides, especially with insects. I mean, if they're big, just pick them off,
Sure.
or use a soap or something like that. The same way with some of these diseases, but because again, unless you have that problem year after year after year, I don't advocate fungicide use, because a lot of people just aren't trained very well for it. And then you got to select a fungicide that's going to be effective. Not all of them are going to be effective for all different kind of fungi. So, and we really don't, since we don't have a lot of commercial production here and things like that, we don't have any guidelines. Some states, bigger states, will actually have extension, will have recommendations for fungicides and things like that, which are pretty helpful, but it's mostly for crops, things like that.
Yeah.
So that's my take on that.
Great, Bill. Well, this has been a whirlwind of a good conversation, getting through every topic and point that we've had. Really appreciate your time and your willingness to join us and educate us on plant pathology.
Good. Well, I'm glad to be here. It's kind of fun.
Good. Well, maybe we can bring you in on another topic and focus in on some of these other diseases down the road. And so for everyone, I'll just wrap us up here and get us going. We want to highlight the Barnyards and Backyards. If you could share your screen, Jenny. Barnyards and Backyards website is where we post all of our the recordings of these shows, post them back up there. We also keep a current schedule for this show. So if you want to see future shows, what's coming up, when they are, please get on there, look at that. The other thing is we're going to put the recording back up there so you can watch it again, or you can share it out with folks. We're also going to show some, put some links in there and some resources that were shared throughout the show there too as well. Bill talked about the Plant Diagnostic Lab. Please reach out to us. We're here to help you, help serve you guys, and try and answer your questions best we can to make it better for you so you know what to do. So connect with Bill with the Plant Diagnostic Center there, or you can contact your extension office, your local extension office. We have one office in every county and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation, and they can also put you in touch with the Plant Diagnostic Lab or help answer those questions locally. So then the last thing we have is we'd like you to follow up, give us some feedback. We're going to send you an evaluation. I think Jenny already threw it in the chat box. here on Zoom and also in the comments there and Facebook Live. If you have a chance, please fill that out, send it to us. It's really helpful for us. And then also it helps steer our show a little bit. For those of you in Zoom, when we close, you'll be prompted in an internet browser for that evaluation. So if you can just take a few minutes, I think it's like 5 questions in that evaluation, won't take you long at all. But anyway, with that, thank you so much. Have a great Friday. Have a great weekend. Wear some sunscreen. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us.
Thanks,
guys.
Bill.
Thanks, Bill.